So welcome everyone. This is the fifth lecture of the lecture series Populism in History and Theory, organized by the New School for Social Research and the Faculty of Social Sciences at Utrecht Lorraine University jointly. Today our guest lecturer is Jean Cohen. Jean Cohen is the Nell and Herbert M. Singer Professor of Political Thought and Contemporary Civilization at Columbia University. She has taught in Germany, France, Canada, and Italy as well during the years many times. Her areas of interest are political theory, of course, in general, but also sovereignty, human rights, religion and democratic constitutionalism, gender and the law, civil society, and social movements. She is the author of countless articles and also numerous books, including Civil Society and Political Theory, co-authored with Andrew Erato, and Religion, Secularism, and Constitutional Democracy. She is also the co-editor-in-chief of Constellations. Recently, she is working on the theory of populism and on the relationship between civil society, social movement, and populist parties. And this will be the topic of the lecture as well, which is titled as The Political Parties and Populism, How Populism Transforms Democracy. The floor is yours. Thank you very much again for accepting the invitation. I am really looking forward for your lecture.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to give this presentation. Actually, I have to say that the religion book you mentioned was an edited volume. It appears probably wrongly on my website. The more recent book that I did was by myself, which was a monograph, was Globalization and Sovereignty. Anyway, so this talk draws on a chapter of a second co-authored book that I'm doing with Andrew Erato. Our first was Civil Society and Political Theory. So my focus is the nature and impact of populist parties on party systems, on political norms, and on practices of political competition and cooperation in democratic polities. Populists, as you know, situate themselves in the democratic imaginary and purport to improve the quality of democracy by creating party forms that are supposedly more democratic and more responsive to the people than established parties. But I argue that the populist worldview and logic involve the creation of a specific form of anti-establishment, anti-party party, and a mode of party politics that undermines instead of enhancing democracy. Whether or not populist parties emerge from below out of social initiatives, from above through the machinations of political entrepreneurs, or both. Political parties are Janus face. They have one foot in civil society, where they mobilize, and one in the state where they participate in governing or legislating. Populist mobilizations are certainly not the first to claim to speak in the name of the people, nor are they the first anti-establishment parties with an anti-party rhetoric to enter legislatures or governments. But populist mobilization has a telos of power, and so it morphs into political parties, while populist leaders and parties, even without an initial social movement background, are impelled to rely on movement type mobilization within civil society, typically managed from above, to maintain their anti-party, anti-establishment posturing. And so, as we'll also see, populists didn't invent the party form that they invariably gravitate towards, the movement party, although their version has distinct features and dynamics. So it's my thesis. I have several theses, but one is that they blur the logic of movement and party, undermining the democratic rules of both. Their worldview makes it unlikely, even if they cooperate with other parties in government, that they accept the legitimacy of the opposition. And indeed, I'll argue that populist party politics entail a dynamic that exacerbate a distinctive type of severe polarization. Now, the analytic distinction between parties and social movements and how they do or should interrelate in a democratic polity is important. So I'll first look into the logic of social movements, taking as the baseline the so-called new social movements that emerged in the 60s and 70s in the West. I'll argue that despite similarities to the rhetoric and anti-establishment stances of these movements, populist mobilizations and political entrepreneurs differ insofar as they are driven by their logic to seek power and hence to enter the party political arena, either as new parties or as capturing existing ones, as in the United States. Political parties are, however, driven by the logic of power, acquiring and exercising it. So I'll talk about that, the ideal typical function of parties, very briefly. But the question is, what kind of political party populists form, and how it impacts the functions and party systems in democracies. This is drawn from a long chapter where I discuss the ideal typical forms of political parties that all the political scientists talk about that emerged since the 19th century: the party of notables, the mass party, the catch-all party, the cartel party, and the movement party. I won't go into this in the talk, but my interest in changing party forms is twofold. First, in how the evolving structure of contemporary catch-all and cartel parties lead to, in particular, their hollowing out and movementization, provide the political, how this provides the political opportunity for populist electoral movements and leaders to emerge as anti-party parties, or to capture existing parties. And then second, my interest is to get the specific form populist parties construct by combining features of the catch-all party type with the movement party form. Populist parties are ideal typically catch-all movement parties. Insofar as they contrast with what Laclau calls, insofar as they construct what Laclau calls chains of equivalence across a wide variety of demands and interests to appeal to a majority of voters, they resemble catch-all parties. But they also invariably adopt the movement party form, although their appeal is neither issue-specific nor wed to programmatic goals, which is typical of movement parties. In the chapter, I also look at three possible causal relations of party and movement forms within the populist phenomena. Types of mobilization that come, and populist rhetoric that come from above, from below, and from in between level of populist parties. So there is a long section on the comparison of cases of different types of populist mobilizations. And I look at, mobilizations by parties, mobilizations by movements, mobilizations by government or an executive, and then mixes. The Tea Party and the Trump mobilization is obviously a mix. And we look at exemplars of this, from Chavez's movement to Fidesz, and I will not say one word about Fidesz here, the five-star Trump, the populist movements of the Tea Party, and then the Trump thing in America, et cetera. So there is an empirical part where we look at the dynamics of mobilization from below, mobilization from above, and mobilization from both dimensions, or for example, in Bolivia, and then actually shift, some of them shift. And then what happens when they come into power? The point about all of this is that there are tensions generated from the hybrid form of the populist movement party type that none of them can escape, and also dynamics that all of them are involved in. But due to time constraints, I'm going to jump right ahead to the discussion of the movement party form, and then to the populist version of such movements. And I hope to make it clear why populist parties, especially when in government, tend to distort, and from this perspective only in this talk, undermine institutionalized pluralist party, democratic party systems. In short, they trigger a mirroring dynamic in other parties, potentially creating a destructive spiral of factionalism, rhetorical escalation, and outbidding. That undermines the ability of parties and party systems to perform their basic functions. And I will also argue that because, unlike the theory of movement parties, because populist parties in power cannot normalize, they don't redifferentiate the movement and party form while remaining populist in power, this exacerbates polarization and further delegitimizes the opposition, etc. So throughout the book, we know that there is an elective affinity of populist parties in power with authoritarianism, and this is one piece of that puzzle. But, and we can discuss this in the discussion, their success is not inevitable. Other parties have a choice of how to respond to populist strategy. And counter movements also have choices about resisting and finding alternatives to the populist logic. And we can just discuss that later on. So first of all, movements and their logic. So the types of social movements that matter are political in the sense that their means of collective action can be recognized as legitimate and their ends can become binding for the wider community. Such protest movements purport to articulate generalizable interpretations of values, aims, and needs and interests of groups that political parties allegedly failed to represent. While their quintessential locus is civil society, movements have a specific political logic and relationship to institutional politics that I call, and that we have called in our civil society book, the politics of influence. So they don't organize to stand for election, enter parliament, and govern. They're not political parties, but they seek to influence political parties that do enter governments and exercise authoritative political power. Their mode of organizing is indicative of this distinctive logic of influence. It's informal. I'm speaking ideotypically, of course. Informal, ad hoc, discontinuous, context sensitive, often horizontal and egalitarian, although they can have plebiscitary dimensions too. They don't develop highly differentiated vertical organizational structures. They usually have rudimentary membership rules and staffs. They avoid dues, depend on donations, and they use networks and volunteerism, etc. So their representative function is different from that of political parties. They do articulate ends and norms that can become binding, but they rely on other more organizations, parties, to mediate these to authorities, into authoritatively, collectively binding decisions. So they seek to influence, not exercise institutional political power. And that frees them from the responsibilities of governing and from the pressure to temper their demands. Movements tend to frame their ends in principled, non-negotiable terms, moralistic ones often enough. Yes, no, us, them, the desirable, the intolerable, etc. While all movements contain fundamentalist and realist, self-limiting dimensions, the former tend to be louder. So, as Klaus Offer argued long ago, they are incapable of negotiating or bargaining because they can't make credible commitments on behalf of those they represent or speak for. Movements lack the relevant properties of formal organizations, like the internal bindingness of representative decisions, by virtue of which formal organizations ensure the terms of the terms of political deals will be honored. So this, in addition to the moralistic value and priority ascribed to their demands, makes compromise difficult and potentially self-defeating. But that's okay. That's what movements do. But no social movement can sustain militancy on a society-wide basis in the long term. So they have to, but they do want to affect politics. So they face a trilemma of mutually exclusive options. They can organize a separate political party, they can stay neutral between parties and act as a pressure group, or they can ally with an existing party to gain influence as a fraction within one, among other fractions. And many established parties, in fact, as we know, began as movements, the obvious example being the labor movement and social democratic parties or labor parties. Now, for the social movements of the 60s to the 80s, the choice was between acting on the level of culture in the public spheres of civil society, generating forms of influence in parties, creating alliances, or forming new parties. But because of their interest in protecting their forms of life and unrestricted forms of discussion of self-protection and self-expression, they saw forming parties as co-optation, a dangerous trap. Some did participate in the electoral game, and they formed what they called also anti-party parties. Yet these could play a democratizing role so long as they were out of power, or, and this is a key point, if they abandoned their fundamentalist anti-establishment, anti-party rhetoric and accepted differentiation between the party and movement form of their organization once they participated in the political game, along with accepting the opposition, compromises, and alliances. An example of such a dualistic and differentiated strategy is obviously the German Greens at that time and later. So there are some parallels, but also important differences in the contemporary version of movementization, the supposed democratization of party politics by contemporary politics, who insist on direct participatory inclusion of ordinary citizens in the anti-party movement parties, and of course, direct connections, many of which are plebiscitary through digital media, rallies, etc., acclaim of leaders, and substitute for party hierarchies, etc. But as I will argue in a moment, populist parties are, for reasons of their worldview and dynamic, unable to normalize and de-differentiate. But let me get to the issue of parties and their logic before I get to that. So obviously the logic of parties in a democracy, and there's an increasingly important new literature on parties for obvious reasons, because they seem to be in trouble. Rosenblum, Weirhead, Dalton, Katzenmeier, Rosenblum and Shapiro, etc. But still, most agree with Schachtschneider's famous statement that political parties created democracy, and modern democracy is unthinkable, save in terms of parties. The condition of parties is the best possible evidence of the nature of any regime. That's Schachtschneider. And a party is a political organization and an organized attempt to get control of government. So obviously the logic of parties is the logic of power, attaining it and exercising it. And making collectively binding decisions. Now, democratic party systems entail multiple parties that shape conflict, regulate rivalry, acknowledge their partisanship and partiality, such that no party speaks for the whole, even if it articulates a vision for the whole, and not only the interests of its constituents. Democratic parties accept that their exercise of power is provisional, as is the status of the opposition, depending on the next election. At issue is a political democratic ethics, a willingness to compromise, accept the good at the expense of the best, a decision to tolerate or welcome diversity in order to be the majority, respect for minority rights, political pluralism, and a certain comprehensiveness, so that a party in power can claim to have earned the approval of the great body of the people. Accordingly, party competition and party government entails acknowledgement, acceptance of plurality, dissent, alternation, legitimacy of the opposition, self-limitation, self-restraint, etc. Although this does not rule out polarization and deep commitment or radical partisan positions. So as I mentioned earlier, the shift in party types in the second part of the 20th century has been noted by analysts. I mentioned it here only to indicate the phenomena of hollowing out and movementization of parties that relates to these shifts and to populist mobilizational success. So let me explain. By hollowing out, I mean the evisceration of what Katzenmeier, for those of you who know some political science, call the party on the ground, the party organizational infrastructure outside of government, the middle level, local, regional elites, the intermediate party organs constituting the party and civil society tends to wither away. Parties become hollow, dominated by the party in public office, who in turn tend to develop and rely on their own staff instead of on the party organization, on external funding, whether it's from the state or from corporations, in America's corporations, or myriad small donations instead of party dues, etc. So hollow parties are no longer robust presences in civil society, and they seem decreasingly able to police their boundaries. They seem to focus more on gaining state power and exercising it than on involvement in and representation of and expression of civil society. Contemporary populists capitalize on and exaggerate these developments by criticizing established parties rhetorically as elite cartels, la casta, partiocracy, and purporting to avoid these dilemmas by embracing movement party forms in the name of democratization, and by denying their version of the denying that their version of the anti-party party is a party at all. Okay, actually, I do see hollowing out as the culmination of the catch-all party form, but it's not inevitable. So movement parties, what is the movementization of parties? The concept of movement party, as some of you may know, was developed by Kitschelt quite a while ago to capture the links between the logic of movement and party in a party form that emerged after the rise of the catch-all party and the new social movements. Movement parties are a distinct hybrid. that applies the organizational logic and strategic practices of social movements in the arena of party competition. They coalesce around salient issues and groups that remain unrepresented or underrepresented by conventional parties. And like social movements, they lack extensive and intensive formal organizational structure, staff, offices, and have low-cost membership. And they tend not to develop, initially at least, an internal hierarchical structure of designated organs and officers with authority to make binding decisions. But they are electoral actors. They are parties, despite their protestations to the contrary. They compete in democratic elections and seek political power. Importantly, movement parties need not originate in social movements. This is important. They may latch onto mobilizations that social movements generated, but they don't even have to do that. What matters in the movement party as a form, a hybrid form, is the adoption of movement logic, organizational models, and tactics while competing electorally. Some movement parties may be loyal to charismatic leaders, others may insist on so-called direct democracy, but it's their lack of investment in problem solving, fluid organizational structure, and informality and fluidity of membership, alongside insistence on maintaining purist, absolutist, and oppositional stances that is central to most movement parties. So the movement party merges the logic of movements, influence, and the logic of parties, power. But I think tendentially perverting both the representational and governing functions of parties and undercutting the self-limiting and democracy expanding role of movements. So Kitchelt, when he wrote, saw movement parties as transitional. He thought their contradictory hybrid features that combine movement and parties logics make them unstable, and that it would be the logic of effective inter-party competition and the demands of governing responsibly, the exercise of public power in liberal, plural constitutional democracies that would push them to transition and normalize into more standard party forms or to devolve back into social movements. And he assumed that if you once succeeded in acquiring a legislative majority, a movement party could hardly resist the pressure to turn into an ordinary party. By the way, there's another form of movement party that comes through, that fits the American case more, that occurs through alliance. And I don't want to go into this too much, but a movement like the labor movement can ally with the party, the Democratic Party. It would acquire shifts on both sides. The movement would de-radicalize, the party would articulate some of its aims, and it could have a productive relationship whereby it becomes a fraction among other fractions in the party. That's not the same as co-optation of a party, which we saw that with the Tea Party and what's going on with the Republicans. That's a different ballgame. So that happened. The classic example of that was the Democratic Party allying with Labor in the New Deal and after. Now, alliances with movements can penetrate a party, but in the case of hollow catch-all parties and populist movement pressures that help to further hollow them out, this can morph into party capture, especially if the movement fractions inside the party are allowed to hold on to their movement features. So the movementization of parties linked to populism is distinct, and I argue that it doesn't follow Kitchel's path of normalization. The hollowing out of catch-all parties is one of the political opportunity structures, also their politics, of course, for the populist emergence and success through capture or successfully forming new parties. And the current populist wave, as you can see, didn't create movementization of parties or their hollowing out, but populist parties and movement parties in the structural sense, no matter how they arose, and they can't normalize. And I want to sort of articulate why. And now I get to the logic and worldview of populism. This has been rehearsed 100 times. Everybody's heard versions of this, but I'm focusing on the dimensions that pertain to party politics and populist party politics. So, in other words, the elements of the worldview that orient populist political organizations, and these include the following. First of all, Manichaeism, that identifies the good with the will of the sovereign people and evil with conspiring elites and their alleged clients. A porous pro-total logic that extracts the true people, their authentic majority, the real sovereign from the rest of the population, and casts its representatives, i.e. the party and the leader, as their embodiment. A friend-enemy conception of politics, and the anti-establishment stance that can't be abandoned even when they're in power, when it's in or the government. While left and right populisms can be distinguished by the host ideologies they embrace, and the policies they enact, it's the worldview that they share as populists and the rhetoric that dictates the anti-party form of populist political organizations, both in and out of power. Now, there are four dynamics that populism unleashes with regard to party political organization. What we can call, following Sartori, the refactionalization of political parties follows from the pars pro toto logic. The friend, enemy, and Manichaean conception of politics fosters, and I will discuss this, a new form of severe polarization. Together with the anti-establishment stance that turns populist parties into a distinctive type of anti-party, anti-system catch-all party, movement party, and fosters the movementization of parties generally, and furthers polarization. Then finally, the anti-status quo orientation of populist parties goes with their willingness to eviscerate democratic norms, constitutionalist principles, rule of law, minority rights, if these are deemed antithetical to the requirements of representing the will of the sovereign people. Now, in the time I have left, I can only discuss one of these. In the chapter in the book, I discuss all of them, and I will therefore focus on polarization, because we had a talk on societal polarization, but this is political polarization. Of course, they come together. So the friend-enemy logic and the populist mode of polarization. So the friend-enemy logic is obviously inherent in of politics, is inherent in populism, connects with the part-whole logic. Insofar as adversaries are not considered part of the true people, the opposition is delegitimized, and it furthers the factionalization of parties and party systems, the part pretending to be the whole, although it really is, after all, a part. But equally, if not more important, is that populist friend-enemy politics contribute to a form of extreme political polarization that threatens democratic principles and makes disagreement, contestation, dissent, pluralism within an inclusive polity constructive instead of destructive. As Sartori aptly put it, dissent draws from consensus and conflict, but coincides with neither. He also observed that the non-party party denies the very principle of diversity and institutionalizes the repression of dissent. He had in mind, of course, when he wrote, ideological anti-system parties of the far left, communism, and the far right, fascism, that purported to speak for the whole, whether construed as the working class or the ethnic nation. With this in mind, he developed a theory of extreme polarized pluralism that distorts democratic party systems. Obviously, he was thinking of Italy in the old days. For us, the question is, what is distinctive about the polarization produced by populist anti-party catch-all movement parties? We can talk about the interesting question of whether they can be described as anti-system parties later. Sartori analyzed polarization in terms of ideological distance between parties and candidates. Extreme polarized pluralism involves the presence of one or more anti-system parties at opposite ends of the ideological spectrum, and a party occupying the center of the political space. The anti-system party is a party whose ideology is extraneous. It doesn't share the values of the political order that it's in. So an anti-system party undermines the legitimacy of the regime it explicitly opposes and wants to change not only the government, but the entire system of government. Its opposition is an opposition of principle. Extreme polarized pluralism ensues when there are bilateral, mutually exclusive counter-oppositions of the anti-system party type that can't join forces. The center is occupied by another party or coalition and excludes alternation in power with the anti-system parties on both flanks, so the whole thing distorts democratic political competition. Contemporary populist party politics differ in important ways from this version of extreme polarized pluralism. Populist catch-all movement parties, it's a mouthful, I admit, are not strongly ideological parties comparable to communists and fascists. Instead, they are eclectic regarding the host ideologies they latch onto and flexible, and they present as anti-party parties, not anti-systems, not as anti-system parties. And instead of calling for the abolition of the entire system of government, they claim to be committed to improving or maybe refounding the democratic regimes in which they emerge. But nevertheless, the friend-enemy orientation of populist parties, together with their pars pro toto logic and anti-establishment rhetoric, fosters a distinctive form of pernicious polarization and a party form, as I said, the anti-party populist catch-all movement party, that similarly to the older explicit anti-system parties undermine the legitimacy of the democratic system in which they operate. So I want to argue that contemporary populism fosters a distinct form of what has been called in the literature effective political polarization. This is based not on ideology, but on social identity and identification driven by partisanship. The sorting of people into opposed political camps, partisan sorting, around an overarching cleavage that extends into the social sphere, stacked identity elements, race, religion, region, ethnicity, penetrating into everyday life of socializing, schools, churches, residential communities, media, etc., so that exclusion and segregation from the opposite camp follows is characteristic of effective polarization. But effective polarization also entails extreme feelings of dislike, animosity, hostility, and lack of trust to the opposed party members and supporters. The concept of social distance plays a key role here because effective polarization entails the avoidance of social interaction without group members and of their media sources, etc. Pre-existing social cleavages can, but need not be the basis of effective political polarization. And their existence is insufficient to predict this kind of polarization. Ideology and ideological sorting can still play a role here, but the point is that identity politics are central in effective partisan polarization. So it's worth noting that genuine and even deep disagreements and social segmentation don't in themselves lead to effective partisan polarization, nor does coherent ideological sorting. In America, this is somewhat new, so that conservatives and liberals are confined to different parties. But this doesn't necessarily entail extreme ideological or effective polarization. These parties still may be willing to cooperate. Recent analysts of populist incitement of severe effective polarization argue that identity-based polarization is interactive, relational, and involves a political process led by populist political entrepreneurs designed to generate, deepen, amplify, and exploit sociopolitical cleavages and resentments. The relevant rhetoric and signals by populist political entrepreneurs and activists aim precisely at fostering the construction of socio-political relations in which opposed, comprehensive, and exclusionary, mutually hostile identities and identifications are established. Valence issues in which one party is accused of incompetence or corruption gets linked to political social identities so that parties, their members, and voters are othered, excluded from the acceptable range of social differences. Those are only acceptable within our group. Typically, populist-inspired versions of effective polarization is led to the politics of resentment, the effective dimension that involves blaming someone, elites, the groups they support, outsiders, whatever, on the other side of the political frontier, rather than something, economic, social, technical change and public policies for particular grievances, exacerbating the us versus them dynamic. Accordingly, contemporary populism fosters a widespread subtype of polarizing politics that oversimplifies politics by aligning cross-cutting differences along generalized elite and their supporters versus the people distinction. It's not hard to pinpoint the specific logic and commitments inherent in populism that foster this form of a polarization and that make it pernicious for party systems. The populist politics are perforce, that populist politics are perforce identity politics follows from their worldview and logic. We saw that with Laclau. A lot of it sounds like Laclau, although he thinks it's good. The friend enemy conception of political, the Manichaean worldview, pars pro toto logic, and anti-establishment stances leads political populist entrepreneurs to use polarizing political rhetoric and intentionally trigger severe effective polarization. And the problem is that political systems in which populist parties become powerful and enter into legislatures and government have a strong tendency to mimic them, so that party political competition is skewed and becomes polarized along the lines populists set up, etc. So, in fact, it's also not hard to show that populist identity-based effective polarization then has pernicious effects on democratic party systems and democratic norms. Every political party, of course, in a democracy, aggregates interests and opinions and seeks identification with its projects by a majority. It should be noted that from a democratic normative standpoint, ideological or policy polarization isn't ipso facto democracy eviscerated. Democracy entails the right to dissent and openly disagree, and have your ideological commitments. And in an open society and democratic polity, the level of ideological and policy disagreement should reflect people's free choices and free process of opinion formation. No democratic norm is violated by the public expression of deep ideological disagreement or dissent. Although deep disagreement in deeply divided societies may make political cooperation and compromise harder, but the counterpart to the right to dissent and disagree and even polarize on the first level of popular preferences, policy preferences, is the obligation to respect the other as a fellow participant on the second level, and to treat opponents as sharing a civic identity with oneself as a co-participant in democracy. So populist friend-enemy dynamics has the effect of undermining precisely the civic standing of those on the other side of the frontier, to use Laclau's word, construing them as not part of the people and their party political representatives as ultimately illegitimate, even if you allow them into the electoral game. This clearly violates the democratic obligation to interact with the opposing parties and their supporters as fellow participants in democratic self-government. I'm almost finished here. So the effect of polarization that populist parties perforce foster also can distort political competition by fostering outbidding, but if other parties follow suit, and then everyone begins to engage in outbidding, overpromising on the part of, and as we know, populist parties in power tend to refuse to take responsibility for their policies, even when it's the government. And so if this dynamic, they tend to blend them, if this dynamic is reproduced on the part of the opposition, then the whole Democratic Party political process is undermined. Sartori argued that for the kind of polarization that he analyzed, I think it's also true for the kind of polarization that populists engage in, whether or not you want to cast them as anti-system parties. So it's a kind of, Sartori refers to this as an inflationary disequilibrium that can follow. And the movementization of parties plays into this. I argue that populist movement parties can't normalize along the lines Kitchell assumed while remaining populist because of the anti-establishment logic, the stance as a non-party movement party, and the need to continually mobilize a claim and foster movement action from above that they control to demonstrate their bona fides as anti-establishment and as the embodiment of the majority. So even when successful in coming into power, populist parties retain or manufacture an anti-party movement stance, reinforce a hybrid character, and tend to transform the dynamics of party competition accordingly. Finally, what I would would say that in a weird way, their logic is most, they're the only embodiment of the sovereign people, but they have to be at least allow elections insofar as they remain populist, even when they are in power. But their anti-party discourse generates hostility towards other traditional party organizations and forms. But as a hybrid political type, they don't escape the contradictions of the movement party form any more than other movement parties do. So the issue is, of course, the longer they're in power, what this pushes them towards. And I tend to think it pushes them towards more severe polarization, more severe outbidding, and more authoritarian stances. Now, what I would say is that it's not inevitable that other political parties in a situation where populist parties are in government and dominate, it's not inevitable that they have to follow that path. I mean, some people like left populism. I think you can figure out from this that I'm not, that I don't. And I think it's a mistake, a severe mistake to go that route. But I think that there are, I would say that that there's another dimension of populist critiques of the former parties in the party political system, namely their inattention to demands of and inequality and welfare deficits and status deficits. That's absolutely correct. But I think their solution is wrong. But I would also say that we do have a kind of example in the United States right now of a party, the Democratic Party, that at least some segments of it chose a different route successfully. I mean, the Democratic Party has factions within it, but no faction became it didn't turn the party into it didn't, how was the word? Oh, it has fractions, but it didn't factionalize the party. It's plural. It has a multiplicity of groups in it, and they really do interact and compromise. And they have not taken on the stance of the Republican Party, which became a populist party. So interestingly enough, also, I would say that one of the greatest successes, at least in parts of the country, of the Democratic Party's alternative strategy, namely in Georgia, by Stacey Abrams, was to actually rebuild the party on the ground. Instead of engaging in the populist strategy of publicitary mobilizations or movement style, this and that, the actual strategy was to rebuild connections, actual face-to-face connections of the party on the ground, which was then able to successfully bring out its voters and challenge the Republican Party, at least there. So I'll stop with this. There's lots more to say, but I think I've talked long enough, and we can have a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The floor is open for discussion and questions. So if you have any question, comment, then please raise your hand. Adam has a question then.
Hi, Professor Cohen. Thank you for that. That was exceptional. I was curious by the term you used at the end of actual face-to-face connections. My mind immediately went to the crisis of representation, and I was curious if you understood it as solving that issue, or really just what you meant by the term actual, beyond a literal going to a doorstep, what meaning an actual connection has as opposed to a fictitious.
Oh, well, I mean, I just threw this out. I don't know if I would put that much weight on the word actual, but I would say, again, I don't know if you know the cartel party thesis of Cats in My Ear, or where I'm drawing this from. They have several books on this. It's worth looking at. And there's some problems with this thesis. But the argument about the hollowing out of parties has been made with respect to I mean, basically Western European parties, I think. I don't know if they've had in mind Eastern Europe. By them and by other theorists with regards to the United States. They're very different party systems, but anyway. And the idea is that in a way, it's true that the old model is always the mass party, though not in America, since we never had a mass party system. We always had catch-all parties, but that's okay. In any case, the idea is that the parties have shifted away from doing, having local offices in every section of a city, you know what I'm saying? So presence, what Gramsci called presenza, presence, in civil society everywhere where you could actually connect with people, hear them out, go to their meetings, listen to their stuff, et cetera, et cetera. And instead, the idea is that, and also the other functions, the membership dues, all this stuff. So there's been a tendency, starting with the Catchall Party form itself, to lose this kind of connection. Now, you can also say there's obviously the new media might play a role. But one could say that one of the reasons for, so that's technically the hollowing out, okay? The hollowing out, that whole infrastructure between the person who's supposed to be being represented in society and the party leaders seems to be gone. Okay, but something else has gone on, which I didn't get to because this paper is so long, this chapter is so long. There's also this issue of, due to moving pressure, the rise of primaries, so that the party lead has sort of lost control also over candidate selection, right? The party has lost control over the lead. They do their own thing, they mobilize their own money, et cetera. But at the same time, candidate selection, I mean, of course, they want the party label still. But nevertheless, and this is also happening in Europe, apparently, the big problem with the Republican Party and Trump right now is that they're threatening primaries and that the party won't be able to control the candidates. All right. Now, I don't subscribe to the view that primaries are the cause of everything horrible that's happened, because the alternative was the backroom deals, the cigar smoking of these elites who had, that's not an ideal for me, especially since they're all male. But anyway, the point is rather that, well, you can look at the Democratic Party, they have primaries, and there are sometimes attempts, but you can handle that if you do it in a sober way. So I think that's what I meant. What I meant was that, again, I don't think you can rebuild the old mass party. Many Europeans are nostalgic for that. I don't think it's possible, but especially with the new media of communication. And don't ask me about this media because I'm too old to deal with this, Facebook and all this stuff. You guys know how you connect on this. But the point is, nevertheless, none of these new media are really adequate replacements for presence on the ground. I think that's true. It's always a mistake when new media come up to think that, oh, the old public sphere's over, nobody's going to read a book because there's television, nobody's going to watch television because there's internet. But of course, it's not true. These supplement. On the other hand, the dynamics of these media do matter. And you have party forms now that a 5-star Clinton is a digital party, digital non-party according to itself. I have things to say about that. But in any case, it might be a digital non-party, but and that facilitates participation, but participation is not the same thing as democratization. So much for that. In any case, so what I meant was that the role of parties in connecting with those who they purport to represent still matters. And I do think the door-to-door stuff and having structures in which people can come together, and parties aren't primaries can be those structures, or caucuses, whatever, matter. And what we need to do, again, I'm not an expert, I'm really not an expert on the Democratic Party or on party systems, despite what it might sound like, is nevertheless strengthen these mediating forms and undo to a certain extent, the hollowness and the movementization of parties, if we want to avoid where that leads us in terms of, competition and so forth. So that's what I'd say. Again, I don't know if this fits with Eastern Europe at all, but in terms of contemporary stuff in the West and I think it fits with Orban, Fidesz, movementization stuff works from above, but I don't know how hollow it is. I don't know how it actually works as a party in Hungary, but
Antar raised his hand, so please.
Okay, so first of all, I want to thank you this excellent lecture. I think I learned a lot. I learned a lot about the party system, the parties and the populism, how they are connected. I have 2 questions, quite concrete questions. The first one is that on the map of the parties in the world, there are not so many, but still there are some which can be called as ethnic parties, or even they call themselves as ethnic parties. Does it mean that this kind of party formations has a kind of essential populist background or characteristic? Because the main goal of the party to integrate and represent the ethnic community on the political arena. This is the first question. The second question is, I was just thinking that usually all the presidents in America, after the inauguration in their speech, they say that they want to be the president of all Americans. Is it a populist statement or not? Because they don't want to change the system, but still they promise something which is above the system, originated from the presidency. Okay, these are the two questions. Thank you so much.
Well, I'm going to take them in reverse order because, of course, I know about the American presidency more than I do about ethnic parties. But I mean, the weird thing about our system is that the only one who purports, unfortunately, to speak to all, I'd rather say speak to all, is the president. I mean, it's a real perversion of our institutional setup that Congress has such an incentive to just do local stuff and represent, basically local lobbyism, so that it's so hard to get, unlike a parliament where a party controls the parliament, you actually pass national legislation. So, all right. But so the point is that it's nothing. I think ordinary parties and the president can and should say, obviously, a particular party elected me and I speak for them, but I'm not just a particularistic corrupt faction. I do want to govern for all, meaning that the kind of partisanship that I have is, we have a party program. I mean, parties used to have programs, but anyway, we have a party program and we think this is what's good, not just for us, our members, but for everyone, right? In a certain way. So higher wages would be better for everybody, something like this. So that in a sense, a party in a democratic system that wins power has to stand for everyone, but it doesn't represent everyone in an immediate sense. That's false, because it's not the populist version, because there's the opposition. There's a minority. It doesn't speak for everyone, but it speaks to everyone in the sense that you're supposed to govern for the good of the polity, not just for your grubby private interests or just for your party. So it's a fine distinction, but I think it really matters. I mean, the presidency as an institution, that's a whole other set of problems. There are serious problems with it because I don't think it's a good institutional setup that we have, but that's something else. And it does invite this kind of populist stance, but it's not identical. Parties have to speak for the part and the whole, but they don't embody the whole because there are other parties. There are parts that are partisan, but the non-corrupt way of being partisan, you don't just give the goods to your members and treat everybody else like crap. That's the populist way in power. No, you're supposed to actually allow, impartial administration, all this other stuff. Now, in terms of ethnic parties, well, it depends on the context, because, I mean, the ethnic party, I don't know if they call themselves an ethnic party, but the obvious example in terms of the populist universe would be Mas and Morales in Bolivia. It is Bolivia, right? Yes, right? So of course, it's the, what are they called? The, not the indigenous, the mixed and indigenous that had been excluded from the political, and he is mestizo, they had been excluded from the political system forever, but it emerges also out of a labor movement and indigenous. So I don't know if that's an ethnic party, because it wasn't really ethnic nationalism, I don't think. So that's the one, that's one version. But once you enter into power, and then they came into power, and he came into power, and then he did become alarmingly, he didn't want to let go of power, which tends to be a dynamic of populists. But I wouldn't say that all ethnic parties are populist, because some, I don't study this, but some would want inclusion, right? I guess you get an example would be India. Somebody could speak to India here. Some ethnic or religious parties simply want forms so that they're not discriminated against and want fairness and inclusion. I prefer a political form that doesn't allocate votes and seats on the basis of that kind of belonging. I think that's a mistake, but I think that you can have mechanisms in which you actually, can combat discrimination. But so no, I don't think all ethnic or nationalist parties are by definition populists. I think it would depend on the constellation and the kind of talk and speech that they do. But once you're in power, and if you play the ethno-political game, and the true Hungarian, or I mean, with Trump, it was white nationalism. I don't know if that's ethnic. I guess I don't know what that is, but it's white Christian nationalism, and that's a very serious force in America, very frightening. But so that was certainly populist. And then the populist attempts to demonize and exclude immigrants, and well, in France they pretend that they're secularists, but that's just code for saying we don't want Muslims here. That's what that is. But in any case, so that's the answer.
Okay, thank you. Other questions and comments? Portagard has a question.
Jean, thank you for a really interesting presentation. There was a lot in it. I'm still digesting it, if I'm honest with you, because it was very thoughtful. I just had two thoughts for you. One is you spent a lot of time talking about polarization, the effects of these parties polarizing in party systems. And I wonder if, and I certainly think that's very important to look at, but I also wonder if there's something different about the Manichaeism that they display. Kirk Hawkins talks about this as the core feature of populism. So there's distinction between good and bad. And you talked about friend and enemy. My point is there's a distinction between having systems where are polarized, where you have ideological disparities and moving to the sides and there's no center ground. But there's also a fundamental difference which populism brings, which is to bring a moral dimension into politics. Just asking whether Manichaeism might be another dimension to layer on top of the polarization that maybe exacerbates some of the tendencies you're talking about.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, I mean this.
One more quick question. Can I just ask whether does your thesis also apply to the American Populists, the People's Party, in its original form, its original incarnation, or is this a very specific thesis applying to contemporary populist parties only?
Okay. Well, yeah, the Manichaeism is an important part of the populist worldview that plays a key role in this. And in the longer chapter, I have separate sections on each one of these. But I thought I'm not going to torture you to death by going through everything. So yes, of course, it has to do with this moralization of politics that maps onto the friend enemy thing and the anti-establishment stuff, and then all of this. Each one of them really fosters polarization, and even the anti-establishment stuff does. But it makes it a particularly pernicious form, especially when you attach it to not an ideology. I mean, ideologically, I think the communists thought, the capitalists were pretty bad, but when you attach it, but it wasn't personal in the same way. But when you attach this to people, to groups, and when this maps onto, it's not just it's a political identity that then in America, for example, really penetrates the white evangelical Christian population, so that you cannot imagine ever voting for a Democrat. That's not what white evangelical Christians are. You can't. They are, demonized as the other. So yes, it plays that role certainly in this dynamic. The American Populace, well, that was a mixed bag. I mean, of course, it depends on what point. You're talking about the 90s till the whatever it was, 1910s, 20s. I mean, they start out criticizing corporate capital. This is the movement of the formation of corporations and corporate capital in the United States, I mean, they do. Let me think. It is polarization. I wonder if was it? Well, okay. Unfortunately, it doesn't start out in terms of effective polarization. It's actually pretty ideological at first. Ideological in the sense of challenging the railroads, the corporate capital, the trusts, the rich and the elites that support them. And don't forget, at that time, as you know, American politics was not particularly, even less democratic than it is now. There was no direct election of the Senate, et cetera. And so they fought for a range of reforms, political, to give them more voice, and also wanted kind of alternative route of economic modernization. Let's put it that way. But it did attain a Christian dimension, the cross of gold, Brian, and it did, unfortunately, as soon as they went into politics and became merged with the Democratic Party, became very racist. And what's his name? Who was the arch populist? What's his name? I'm blocking his name. I'm blocking I'm blocking the name of the main figure of American populism in that period. He became an arch racist, even involved with the Ku Klux Klan. So instead of having alliances with the natural allies, African American workers, which some wanted initially. Initially in the South, they actually had alliances. This was when they went political and formed into the party. I mean, merged with the Democratic Party. They took on this terrible racist friend-enemy logic. I mean, effective political polarization, if you want. So I think it did fall into that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so my question is that what do you think? So we can see these attempts to introduce these type of divisions in the society. Probably there are many attempts from political parties, from populist actors. But what do you think, what defines if they succeed to do that, so they can start this circle of deepening divisions, and what are the factors which blocks them, or why in some cases they're not successful?
Right. Yeah, of course. That is the question. I was wondering.
Yes.
I knew you asked that question.
Yeah.
It's the right question. So, I mean, you can offer all kinds of, well, I can't stand this kind of stuff, but
I know it's
rendering equation, right. You can offer all kinds of identities, all kinds of cleavages and et cetera, but obviously it has to map onto something in society. Otherwise, you're just ignored or locked up as a maniac. So obviously, there has to be something going on in society. I would say two things. One is there have to be demands or issues or concerns and divisions in society that this can latch onto and resonate with. That's one thing. These identity offers, if you want. On the other hand, I think it has to be the case that other political parties, the establishment, if you want, or other political parties have not been doing their job in terms of articulating, representing, expressing, constructing the demands, issues, problems, et cetera, that are there in civil society in ways that are responsive and that could avoid this kind of polarization. So there has to be political failure on one level, and there has to be differences in social conflicts or deep disagreements on another level. Sure, I mean, of course, what's interesting to me is that everywhere it's the rural, deindustrialized, losers of globalization. Those strata, although they're not the worst off, but those strata everywhere, from Hungary to France to America and everywhere else, with which this contemporary populist, right-wing populism stuff resonates. Okay, And they use different strategies in different places. Obviously, in America, they don't call themselves secular. That would be, that's the enemy. But in France, they call themselves secular. The secular values of France, of Christian France, got that. The secular values of Christian France cannot be, okay. But in the United States, it's obviously something else. But in the United States, the culture wars, which started with the 60s, we are still, Trump is my generation. I know him. This is the 60s still. And he's wants it to be the 1950s. He still wants it to be Playboy magazine. That's where he's coming from. So those culture wars are still playing themselves out, no question about it. And they are cleavages, traditionalistic, communities, whether they're Christian or whatever else they are. I don't think the fundamentalist Jewish communities are too thrilled with same-sex marriage either. So there are cultural, there are all kinds of cleavages in society that the populist offer has to resonate with. And I think due to failures, politically especially, but also socioeconomic. Also, for me, the status issues matter enormously. And that if you're able to, connect these, it starts in America, it starts with Ronald Reagan and the Southern Strategy. That's suddenly where you get put together the racists against civil rights and the so-called white Christians, got to be white because the blacks are the civil rights, white Christians against political secularism, which was happening. Prayer was getting kicked out of the schools, a lot of other things, which people forget about were going on. That's the Southern Strategy. That makes that link. So there has to be something in society that you can hook onto. But I would say, the weird thing is this. It's going to sound really weird, but I just, again, take the American, we are not as polarized as, it's a mistake to think of us as so socially polarized, and this is what's being reflected in politics. I think that's wrong. Because if you look at the polls, in terms of policy, lots of really vast majorities want what Biden is proposing. I mean, Trump didn't propose, he didn't do anything. I mean, border walls and stuff like that. But so in terms of actual policies and a large range of issues, infrastructure, the COVID package, there's not that kind of polarization. And in terms of the other stuff, of course, the populists bring the crazies into the center, and so that has to be pushed out again. But the degree, so the social differences is not the same thing as extreme social polarization, and that I think it takes political entrepreneurs to thematize and mobilize. And that, to that extent, Laclau is right, but he's not the first one who thought of this. I mean, parties have been doing this for a long time. So especially older kinds of parties like fascist ones, etc. So that would be my answer to that.
Thank you. Please.
Hello.
Yes.
It's great that you allow also guests to participate in such meetings. I think we heard many ideas for very interesting venues of research. But with regard to American parties, I think it would be very interesting to hear the comment on a difference between populism of political parties in the US in history and today. At least it seemed to me from the lecture that populism of political parties today, particularly Republican Party, is considered to be somehow different, maybe a new kind of populism. Could you possibly comment on this? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the contemporary wave of populism is distinctive. I mean, you could also make this argument in terms of Latin America and other places, but of course, there have been populisms in America, since you mentioned America, in the past. And so the question is, what do they have in common? I mean, you had the Populist People's Party, but they never. Well, one of the issues, one of the problems is that the other ones never really came to power. It is true the Populists got some controlled some states. It's a federal system, and they did initiate interesting reforms like the initiative and referenda, stuff like that. But so it's hard to compare when you actually have a populist president who's actually was in power. So you had people like Huey Long, you had people like who's that guy who flew the planes? I don't know, I'm very bad with remembering names, but you also had George Wallace, you had Ross Perot, you had all people trying to set up independent, but they didn't, their own parties, but it didn't work. So the comparison is kind of hard. I think populism as a possibility is co-evil with modern representative democracy, or based on the discourse of popular sovereignty. And even if you didn't say popular sovereignty, democracy, demos rules. I mean, you always have the possibility of people or political entrepreneurs criticizing whatever party system is in place as not representative enough, not democratic enough, and then veering off in the populist direction. I think that's always a possibility. Because that gap is always there. So again, I think that, the biggest and most important populist movement, although maybe Huey Long was a fascist, who knows what he was, but he was a kind of mixture. We have our own homegrown kind of fascism too, but he was a mixture. But again, I mean, they didn't make it to nationalist politics. So, and the American Populist Party of the United States, it's such a different context. I do think the similarities are, there's a structural dimension in which there's a shift to another form of capitalism at that period. And now starting with, globalization and what Danny Roderick would call hyperglobalization, and its impact on undoing, the Bretton Woods welfare state thing. And the effects of the extremes of inequality. Everybody in America, harkens back to the ballot book. These are similar, although different, contexts in terms of fundamental structural transformations, risks of serious dislocation and status losses on the part of large segments of the population. Not the worst off. Again, it's not the worst off. African Americans have been the worst off all along, but they're not populist in that way, which is always amazing to me. But in any case, they want inclusion, not, economic problems. So that's there, but I don't think it's easy to compare the populisms themselves, although the rhetoric you can see is quite similar. But populism adapts its ideology, it takes on host ideologies and adapts to its context. So it certainly wasn't the problem in the 1890s to make America great again. They were just going to make America great for the first time. So, it was not until after the war that we become, imperialist. Is that true? No, we start a little earlier. with the Philippines, but America enters the world scene as a grown-up, in the period of the first populism. So it has to be different rhetoric and discourse, right? So I would say that the populisms differ. Some people want to refer, like Federico last week wants to refer to American populism as pre-populism. I don't know. I'm not sure that, I don't know if I agree. I don't think I agree with that. But I think you have to look at populism in context, but also see what they have together in terms of the logic and the dynamics, which we try to do.
Okay, thank you. Carlos Alvarez has a question, so please.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the lecture. And I was thinking if populist parties tend to create an anti-party environment, as you said earlier, why? And
sorry,
if they, yes.
To create a what? I didn't hear. To create
an anti-party environment in the political system. Yeah, they tend to delegitimize other parties. And if they can play with several ideologies, whether if they're in the left or in the right, why do they often rely on nationalistic values and nationalism rather than on like secular or international values as the left or the socialists used to rely on. I mean, whether they regard themselves as left populism, they also nurture themselves from nationalism. I mean, well, my question is that why, no matter if they are right populists or left populists, they often rely on nationalism and ethnic stances, like as Professor Orkani said earlier too.
Well, I don't know if all populists. I mean, the nationalist thing, that's interesting, but I don't think they all do the nationalist thing. I mean, you can't. I don't think you could. I mean. Wait, what did you say? You said nationalist and you said ethno, right? No. What's the second thing? Right. No, that's not true of Podemos, or I don't think it's true of the Five Stars. Some so-called left populists or Syriza, they didn't do that. I mean, Syriza is no longer populist, and you can morph away. But so I don't think that that's universal. But whether any populist takes on the other dimension of socialist ideology, which is socialist internationalism, I don't know. I can't think of any that does. It could be for the reason that globalization has such a bad rap right now. Although I know about Fujimori, this but that's not left. But right. Unfortunately, that's not left populism. That was neoliberal populism. So by definition, that was, not hostile to internationalism of the neoliberal sort, globalization. But I'm trying to think. Yeah, no, I don't know if populists of the world reunite. I don't think that was so. Yeah, I mean, they select what they want to select from the host ideologies and leave the rest. But I don't know enough. I mean, I haven't, I don't read all these languages either. So I really don't know if anybody's ever come up with an internationalist left populist ideology. I'd be surprised given the current context. I mean, they might like Podemos said, they might not be hostile to the EU, but this whole discourse of sovereignty is so central now, especially for right-wing populism, that's obvious for the right-wing populists. But and as obviously in Europe, the right-wing populists, don't claim that we got to take our sovereignty back. In America, we have to take our sovereignty back. I don't know who we ever gave it to, but we have to take it back somehow and get rid of international institutions. That's clear. So the context the context again and the arguments differ. But I don't know if there's any left populism that actually, do you? Actually articulates internationalism? You? No, I don't know of any. Maybe Andrew does. I see his hand flipping around.
Yeah, just most recently, Varoufakis has proposed a strong European solution to the kind of problem faced by Greece and other countries as well. So, when you see addressing the same issues, there's Wolfgang Streeck on the one side proposing a sovereigntist or a nationalist solution that would support Brexit, for example. And on the contrary, a position like Colin Crouch and Varoufakis, I don't think Crouch is a populist, but Varoufakis certainly was. And there, the idea is that you need a larger unit, you need a larger entity within this the challenges of globalization. So that's not an impossible position. I think the problem is not with that for these people, but rather it's with the social democratic component, because what they look back to ultimately, as I think Denny Roderick always shows, is the Bretton Woods, you mentioned it too, the Bretton Woods arrangement, which allows internal industrial policy. It allows to control the movement of capital in and out. And of course, that's not the reality for Europe. On the contrary, right? And it's not the reality of the WTO system either. And so the problem comes up now for anybody who is a more internationalist social democratic type like Varoufakis, is not so much, I don't think it's going to be so, the difficult part is to bring together like-minded people in different European countries, but rather what the policy content of it will be. How are you going to reintroduce social democracy after its 40-year crisis now, right? And it's, yeah, of course, it's not just the hegemony of the neoliberal option, but also the exhaustion of an answer to them. And, you know, in that sense, I'm very critical of what happened in Hungary because of the socialists and the Free Democrats who were would have been either together or separately would have been in position to generate an option for a new kind of welfare system in Hungary. Unfortunately, no one ever knew. Martin and Antal can correct me, but no one ever really seemed to know what that would be like. And that, you said it perfectly, that opens up the space. And it need not be a radically nationalist proposal, but it will be an eclectic proposal combining elements of nationalism and welfarism in a certain way. So I would say that internationalism, in terms of Carlos's question, is not as impossible as the social policy or the social Europe aspect, which I think is a real difficulty. Now we'll see if Biden manages to solve it. In the United States, we'll have an experiment whether a creative form of reconstructing a left-center policy is going to work. But I think the U.S. has a better chance than anybody.
Okay. Well, I think the question got blurred because the question wasn't whether you can have an international social democratic policy. The question was whether populists can be internationalist. And I think there's an obvious other reason why it's pretty hard. And if Varoufakis is going that way, I don't know what he's doing with his populist side. But in any case, the reason is, of course, its ultimate referent is the people. And the question is, who is the people that it's referencing? So, I mean, you could become a European populist if you think there's a European demos and you have to have a European, state that embodies the people, that sort of thing. But that's not what Andrew was just talking about. So Varoufakis is also a clever politician, and he's correct. I mean, he's Greek. You need Europe. I mean, come on. So that's pretty clear. And then, of course, the problem of social democracy and how to reconstruct something along those lines is a serious issue. But the question was whether there are populist internationalists, and I would doubt it for that reason, because unless you want to call Marxism proletariats, proletarian of the world unite, is that populist? I mean, there were some populist dimensions to certainly Leninism, Marxist-Leninism, but I think it would be tough because the people is usually at the most a national people. So I think that would be hard to be. I mean, you can have an internationalist policy where you want, but that wouldn't be part of the populist dynamic, I suspect.
Okay, thank you. I have a question regarding the American politics as an outsider. You mentioned that sometimes there is a faction of the party which then turns or capture the party.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think about the movement Bernie Sanders started inside the Democratic Party? Could it be a faction which then turns the Democratic Party into a populist party, or it's a different type of factional movement?
Yeah, I wanted to say that's the distinction that I wanted to be clear on, because parties are made up of. I keep on blurring faction versus fraction. It's an annoying distinction, but if you take the concept of fraction from Madison, it's a group that wants to invade the rights of others or the aggregate interests of the public. That's Madison. Okay, that's a different ballgame than a group that has its own has a particular project that it wants the party to take on. So an example would be the labor movement and the Democratic Party in the 30s up to the end, So there were communists in the American labor movement. They were pretty strong in the CIO, and they wanted access to the Democratic Party, and there was, FDR. But that was not going to happen until they de-radicalized and the Democratic Party took up some of the labor concerns. So that was the way in which it became a functioning faction within the party. I can assure you that the Southern Democrats are not into this, but in any case, they didn't capture the party, and they also, A, de-radicalized, and B, severed themselves. They demovementized, as it were. They differentiated themselves. There was still connections between the labor movement outside and the party, but that's the differentiation I was talking about. Now with Sanders and others in the Democratic Party, there are a variety of fractions. Sanders is not the same as the Black Lives Matter group, or as women, for example, or as, whatever else is in there. There's other figures like Elizabeth Warren, but there's a whole, plus the Biden camp, et cetera, right? So there's a lot of different fractions in the party. I don't think Sanders was ever a populist. He's a democratic socialist, for God's sakes. Or a social democrat. Actually, he actually is a social democrat, but in America, that's so alarming that they probably think he's a communist. But in any case, in Europe, he would be laughed out of the room. He's a social democrat. You're not a particularly radical one. But in any case, no, I don't think it was populist. Some of his followers had pretty wild, cathected, effective, relationship with him. I even have a former student who was like that, but that's, what can I say? But no, he was not a populist. And I don't think that, certainly his fraction did not capture the party. It's one, obviously, Biden was elected, not him, within the party primaries, and then to the government, to the presidency. So that's the difference. And the problem with the Republicans is that they're much more centralized and monistic, and the comparable would be the Tea Party. In the past, the American Democratic Party was very fractionalized because you had the Southern racist Democrats, and they were a serious power to contend with, and created and extracted all kinds of compromises, bad ones, from the New Deal onwards. But with the Republican Party, the Tea Party, which began as a rogue movement, but from both directions, it was from below, and then it was AstroTurf types that took it up. There's them, but then it was also a mess of things, because the corporate business interests are not the same as the Christian right in that party, and it's not even the case that everyone in that party would be against, certain regulations and welfare, et cetera. But I think it is true now. We see it. The Tea Party opened the door and paved the way. Plus, using the primary system, which brings in extremists for Trump to take over. And now there really is. You see it. There's an intense battle over over who's going to have that party. I think the battle is going on right now. We see it right now. It's symbolized by McConnell, who, kowtowed to Trump for 4 years, but it's symbolized by McConnell and the old Republican guard and Trump. So the jury's out, but I'm not optimistic. I hope that I would be happy if the moderates win, because we need two parties, and if a Trump Republican Party is the alternative, it's not good news. But they might even split. But they were captured by the Tea Party and by Trump. They were captured. And now there's a rebellion. So that's the difference between having a fraction and then having a faction capture it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
You hinted at several points about the consequences for political democracy, but maybe a summary would be good of why the populist parties' structure and logic have negative consequences for political democracy. But throughout the presentation, you kind of said it many times, but in some ways, I think for an audience, which is also to some extent a class, if you could kind of sum up where is where are the most significant consequences for democracy. Obviously, polarization in itself is not negative for democracy, right? That was Paul Taggart's point, right?
Well,
Okay.
no, effective polarization is negative. Well, I think effective political polarization is negative because it entails a kind of segmental pluralism. It reminds me of the old stuff of Lipset on fascism, but anyway, a kind of segmental pluralism tied to a friend-enemy logic that that does blame, and a politics of resentment that does lead away from the ability to accept and cooperate with the opposition. I mean, again, you know, in a parliament or in a Congress, you're supposed to be willing to cooperate with the other party on committees and stuff like that. And the populist dynamic of its friend-enemy conception, its Manichaeanism, which is moralistic, it's all of this, it's pars pro toto logic, etc., and its anti-establishment stance leads it away from willingness to cooperate in good faith with another party. What they do in America is block. They just block everything. Congress is pathetic. They don't pass anything. I mean, now we'll see what happens, but that's the Democrats. But the populists in power, the Trumpists and the Trump party, all they would do was block anything that Obama tried to do. They didn't seem to be too interested in governing themselves when they were in power either. But in any case, so the dynamic of so the populist worldview and party structure. The other one is the worldview, which I listed these things and the effects it has on party systems, especially if other parties take this up and form themselves in that way. If the counter-populist party is a different left populist versus right populist, then we're really in trouble. The other thing, because it's a monist logic, actually, it's an anti-democratic logic. The other thing is the party form. And you know that I didn't want to go into this because I thought everybody knew it, but I didn't go into it. So the Castle Party form that Otto Kirchheimer first theorized many years ago is a form that, people thought in America, since we had one for a long time, Castle parties for a long time, they thought what it meant was that you appealed to the so-called median voter. So it was a kind of temporizing logic. In fact, Schachtschneider, how do you pronounce his name, when he wrote his book on political parties, was bemoaning the fact that we didn't have enough real opposition and contestation. You have to be careful what you wish for, actually, but that we weren't enough like Europe. We had a real left and a real right. We didn't have anything like that, supposedly. I mean, I think it was wrong, but anyway, the Castle Party form wants to appeal to as many voters as possible. So the logic is that it presents its policy, centrist kind of median voter thing. But at the same time, if that's linked up to a movement party, which populist parties are, I think, by definition, because of their logic, not that they come from movements, but that they, outbid, foster, they need, in part it has to do with the way they view elections and democracy. I mean, elections for them are not about choosing among equally legitimate alternatives. It's about a claim. It's a really kind of selection, like you elect the Pope. I mean, why? Because once you elect the Pope, he's the true embodiment. I don't know, he mediates between God and somebody else. I don't know, you guys are the Catholics, church and people or whatever. So a populist election is kind of like that. You realize who the one is that embodies the true will of the people. And your election is a selection. There can't be anybody else really legitimate. There can't be any other party that's really legitimate on that logic. And so at the same time, you do, since it's electoral, you do have to demonstrate a claim. There is this plebiscitary, almost Caesarist moment to it. And so as a movement party, it has to mobilize and show that it actually, in a Schmittian sense, that identification with the general will and with the true people is ongoing. That's what an election is. An election for a populace is that it's a matter of a claim and identification. Okay, that's the kind of party dynamics that it gets into. And so all of these lead it to have to mobilize, but it's mobilization that wants to control. I mean, Chavez is mobilization once you get power. This was not exactly spontaneous civil society, and the same thing with Trump. I mean, he had dog whistles. He called these people out, etc. So I think that this structure, the anti-establishment stance, and the other features of populist strategy and logic and worldview point in that direction. So they have elections, but they pervert the party system. And as I said, it leads to outbidding, etc. And the real question is whether other parties will mirror that form and dynamic, or be able to challenge it with an alternative that remains pluralistic, etc. So that's what I would say. I mean, again, by the way, this is ideal typical. I mean, you then could use this, if you think it makes sense, to assess various parties that you see as populist and whether they actually do this stuff and how much and how. And again, once they're in power and become the government, there's other dynamics that take root. So it's not just the party dynamic, but I mean, people are nervous about political parties, that the old mass party is gone. The old ideological parties seem to be, fading away. The catch-all party is here, but it's morphing into something else. So there's, as I said, there's a lot of stuff on parties now that people are getting very alarmed about. And the populist ideologies, they're anti-party. What do we need? We don't need parties. We're into immediacy. I immediately embody the people, says the populist leader. Yeah, I got to have a party to get some votes to get into power, but the party part is not the main ballgame, right? And so I embody. I mean, this is plebiscitary dimension, and I could have it claimed through other mechanisms, perhaps.
The Hungarians there know the phrase "haza nem lehet ellenzékbe." In other words, the fatherland or the nation just cannot be in opposition, right? And so, I'm both a Hungarian and an American, right? So for me, that was kind of nice when I saw Trump is exactly an advocate of the same perspective. And he put it somewhat differently. He said, any election that I don't win is the result of fraud. It's not quite as high, not as quite as elevated a thought as Orban's, who's of course a much better rhetorician and a better speaker and better educated and all the rest. So he can say this nice Hungarian thing. But basically, if I lose the election, it was fraud. That's the Trumpian version of the same, because the nation has to vote for me. I am the nation. Now, the point of this is I think that Jean makes all the right points, but it just to kind of make it a little more political. Once you have that belief, you are going to fool around with elections. You're going to change electoral rules if you can. You're going to eliminate electoral supervisory boards or replace them by advocates. You will insist on pruning the votes from potential opponents. But in any case, if you really mean it, and Orban meant it, and Trump meant it, it leads to actions. And those actions are, attack on the media is perhaps the most important, right? Why all these people, and this is universal, even for Morales, who is maybe the most attractive of the types. Attack on the media is, I don't know if López Obrador, Carlos will tell me, if López Obrador has expressed hostility for the independent media. But I think that that's almost universal for these people. And that's connected to the fact that the media might produce an outcome that I will lose an election. I can't lose an election. We can't. And not because I love power, but because I am the nation. And I think that's now, of course, you were talking about the party system and not so much the discourse. But party systems, ordinarily, as we understand them, and this would be true even for council communism, is legitimate only if it has free competitive elections. And populists cannot be friends of free competitive elections, yet they must allow elections. Right? That's the paradox. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, of course, what Andrew says is obviously true, but I didn't want to get into when populists are well, when they're in the government. I talked about when they're the government. I mean, I didn't want to get quite into that because it raises a whole other host of questions about regime type, etc., and I don't want to get into that. But it will be interesting to see whether populists really will accept losing election. I mean, in Turkey, Erdogan did freak out when the Istanbul election was lost, but he's still in power, so we're not there yet. Orban, you tell me. Trump, we saw what he did. But of course, by the way, I will add an aside to that, which you have to know. He was not the first, and populists are by far not the first to attempt to rig elections in America. I mean, there's a long history of attempting to restrict the vote to keep especially African Americans from voting, and especially in the South. So that is not a populist phenomenon. I mean, it's pretty fascist, but it's not a populist. So it's not. There was nothing new. That was not new. The Republican Party has been doing that for some time because, of course, why are they doing that? Because they know they can't win the majority. But it is true that the first time we ever saw a president literally on the basis of nothing deny the results of an election and try to actually literally overthrow it. So that is correct. And I do think that follows from, yes, of course, actions follow. They will do, when I say they don't accept the legitimacy of the opposition, as long as you're populist within the democratic regime, even in power, you have to have elections. But obviously you will then take steps because you don't ultimately accept, you can't accept the legitimacy of the opposition because there cannot be two representatives of the people. And so, or two embodiments of the people, I should say. And so on that logic, a la Cloud, friend, et cetera, frontier, the opposition is always ultimately suspect. And you will do as much as you can to distort, limit, restrict, undermine freedom of elections if you think it might threaten your hold on power. And that includes controlling the media. Berlusconi figured that out pretty early. I mean, he was in media and he destroyed Italian media. And Trump is a media man, obviously. And then, so that includes attempts to control the media and to disenfranchise and to distort, et cetera, et cetera. So that certainly follows from, I think, the populist worldview and the party dynamics that they unleash. Given their conception, the third element is, of course, their conception of election. What is an election to a populist? An election is, as I said, a matter of finding the correct leader.
Okay, thank you. We have still time for one question, maybe one or two.
I'm going to ask you a question.
Okay.
Does the speaker get to ask the host a question? Or the hosts? Two hosts. Not Andrew, the other two. I mean, Andrew and I are doing the books together. So that's
Until and me, yeah, okay.
So how do you think what I said works with the structure? And I don't know the structure of the Hungarian, of Orban's party. And if not, how does it differ? I'm interested. Either the structure or the dynamics of it.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. Until, do you want to start answering the question, or I can. Okay. So I think there's two phases in the let's say. I mean, we had I think two maybe a little bit different types of movement parties. Large ones. I mean, the Jobbik, which was originally the extreme right, and the classical top-down and bottom-up. I'm sorry, bottom-up movement party. Started as a youth movement and then slowly formed into a party, shifting from a movement party to a classic, more hierarchical, etc. Maybe at one point to a similar to a cartel party when they had a crisis. But it was much less as a cartel party as, for example, the Hungarian socialists. So this and the other type is Fidesz, which was more or less top-down, or as we agreed on last week, the top-down and bottom-up movement party after 2002. And then I think they had this double structure, but the movement had this less hierarchical structure, but still the party was very centralized, I think. So in this way, they had the movement tactics, but the party structure in the same time, and which is maybe more or less even the case in several phases after 2010, that they apply the movement discourse and movement tactics, but with very centralized party structure, relying on all the resources they can get from the state and relying on the state's infrastructure as well. On the other hand, the impact and effect of the party on democracy, I think, so with these divisions, is I think it applies. So this was the aim, I think. And when during the talk, I had a case in my head, just playing that after the regime change in 1990, in the first elections, there was always also claims that the campaign is really aggressive and ugly because of some applying this friend enemy distinction. But what the leaders did, that they get into the television, the leaders of the biggest party, János Kis and József Antal, and they were discussing this topic for an hour, claiming that this is an ugly thing, this shouldn't be done like this, and they strengthened the view that they both, although they are adversaries, they both fighting for democracy. Yes, so there was a TV interview with the two of them. This is nothing like can happen in Hungary nowadays. So after 2008, I think, maybe after 2006, there was no communication between Fidesz and the other, and then the governing parties. And now, so we don't have these debates. We don't have these small signs which says that we are one community. We have the signs that this is 2, 3 or more communities with no interaction. So in this case, I think this applies pretty much with the movement tactics and the centralized party structure. And then I will give the floor to Anta to try to answer the question. If there's anything you want to add or correct me.
No, I don't have to correct you, because I agree what you said. The bottom-up movement component, populist kind of movement component, was very influential when they were in opposition between 2006 and 2010. They set up this civic circles movement, and that was very influential to increase their popularity and influence, and in their fight to get back the lost power after the election in 2002. But this kind of bottom-up movement component very shortly disappeared when they got in power. So it became more political communication, a political communication strategy to say that when Orban had to go to Brussels, to the parliament for a hearing, and always he emphasized that he's simply transferring the public will. So what he's saying is it's not even his idea, but it's the will of the Hungarians. So that was the clue, that was the major communication element, and behind there were completely empty so-called democratic procedures like the national consultations. Right now there's a national consultation, for example, they just started about the lift of the restrictions of the COVID-19. And they ask 7 questions raised to the people, and they are saying that they will follow what the people say, what the Hungarians say, but even they cannot imagine that the peoples are divided, and there are half of them say that yes, it has to be lifted, the other half say no, we have to wait. So he cannot imagine that there is plurality in people's mind. He believes that there is only one opinion, and that's what he wants to prove by this very, very manipulative national consultation, which is based on a questionnaire, and people have to answer and send back, and then Orban can say that now 90% of the people agree what we will do. But of course, it's simply, even in political style, it means that in such a question, which is the COVID-19, instead of the authority of the government to make the crucial decisions, he want to see behind him a virtual public opinion. So this is political communication. So I think now the bottom-up, as Marci told, the bottom-up movement element of the governance and the Fidesz strategy completely disappeared, only in the communication. And I agree that what Carlos said actually, that he is very nationalistic. So the nationality, and that's why it reflects a little bit to my question, because the ethnic parties are, let's say in the region, we have a lot of ethnic parties in Slovakia, in Transylvania, Romania, Slovakia, even in Vojvodina, in Serbia. So these kind of parties are cross-cutting the classical party division lines, because they integrate the whole community, which is defined as an ethno community, and they don't question the relevance or the legitimacy of the party structure and the system. They accept the system as a political construction, but close to their values, but they want to bring into the system a completely different kind of community voice. So this is why I think it's even there are not so many ethnic parties. I think in that sense, what exists in Hungary and the neighboring countries, but these are very interesting special cases. Anyway, so the bottom-up component of their so-called populism is completely disappeared, as Marci has mentioned.
Okay. Okay, I think Agnes would like to add something.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry about that. I couldn't join you before, but I had very important meeting that I couldn't miss tonight. So I just absolutely agree with Marton and Antal. I would like to add something which I think Marton and Ákos Kopper wrote about in their article when they analyzed Fidesz and the civic movement and civic circles was developed and run by Fidesz. But I think there is a point of view from the perspective of civil society as well. So I think Fidesz between 1998 and 2002, they actually used the civil society and the frame of civil society and civic organizations. So they really funded and established real, legally established real civil organizations, foundations, associations. So the number of these organizations became pretty high. And then after they won the election in 2010, it happened after they lost the election in 2002 and until they win again in 2010. So that was the process, actually organizing these kind of civil organizations. And I actually researched what happened with these organizations after they got into the power. And I found that about 75–80% of these organizations were just disappeared from the registration. So it was no more registered organization. Most of them actually turned their activity into direct political work. So they became on local or county or national level, different kind of political representatives of the party. Or some of them who stayed, actually, they were very unpleasant when they felt Fidesz left them and did not care them anymore. So they actually complained about Fidesz and the party and the new government's behavior because they didn't care anymore after they won the election. These organizations, but most of these organizations just disappeared. And I think they intentionally instrumentalized the civil society, and they blurred the boundary between civil society and political organization. And I think that was a very intentional political decision or political tactic or strategy to just use as a mean civil society. And of course, they kept one part of civil society, which was the Töff and Peace March. And they actually used this part for, this is not a real civil society, obviously, definitely not independent and autonomous civil society. They are these kind of, I would say, gongos, governmentally founded organizations whose purpose is to show up and openly support governmental decisions. I just wanted to put this to the table, this idea or this thing, this kind of bottom-up building was, I think, an intentional instrumentalization of civil society. This is my point.
It's very important, and I think our time is just up, and know that Jean has to also fulfill some other duties. So unfortunately, because the debates just started to go on a very interesting direction, so we have to finish the lecture for today. Thank you very much for joining us, Jean, and for the inspiring lecture, and thank you for the discussions, which probably we can continue next week. Next week, guest lecturer will be Tadas Kospol, and the topic will be really connected, right-wing populism in the United States, from the Tea Party to Trump. So we will continue exactly what we started to talk about, I think. Thank you very much, and have a nice weekend. Bye.